Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is a programme where you have your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. But today, a little bit different. We're going to have a one-to-one property question time with our guest Simon Das, founder of 978 Group Finance and a residential property investor. Simon, welcome.
Hi Stephen.
Good to have you here. Simon, we're going to talk today about the future of the buy-to-let market, but I have got a couple of questions for you from our viewers first of all. Okay. Now, in the south of England, you're going to love this. In the south of England, where areas are densely populated and developed, green spaces are at a premium and are rightly protected by the various greenbelt policies. Do the panel think that more land in the north of England, in the less populated areas, should be released for new homes, or would the lesser density of working populations limit demand?
You're after our land.
I think we'll move north and nick it.
That's an interesting and a difficult question. I mean, I'm a big environment advocate, and I definitely want to see more protecting of the environment, rewilding of the environment. But ultimately, we do need more houses, and we need them quickly. I think first, before looking at sort of green belt or encroaching further into the countryside, let's make sure that all the areas in local authority plans are really accessible for developers. Make sure the planning system works properly to allow developments in those places to get approved quickly and to allow for, reasonable massing on those areas, and look at the brownfield sites as well. Make sure councils are actively promoting brownfield sites for regeneration and redevelopment first. Following that, I don't see why we shouldn't be looking to make our more rural towns and villages a little bit larger, as long as the infrastructure can handle it. There's quite a lot of towns and villages in the north of England that just cannot handle more people. The schools aren't big enough, there's not enough shops, the transport links aren't healthy enough. So I think if we are looking to allocate more land in the north to housing developments, then we need to support that with infrastructure improvements and not push all that onto developers as well, because you've got the community infrastructure levy and these types of funds. If we put that all onto a developer, it's only going to go onto the house price anyway and make houses less affordable. So
we've done it before. I mean, I can remember Peterborough was a classic case of really extending London in a way, wasn't it? The train lines were electrified. Transport between London and Peterborough was really smartened up and made much more efficient. Not necessarily quicker, but efficient, and that worked. Milton Keynes is another one. So there are towns and areas that are suitable for growth, aren't there? And I think you're right. There's no need to encroach on, beautiful natural lands. No need at all, really.
No.
But I think I do think again. Where I worry is when I hear things like the government, we're going to build 300, 400, 500,000 houses. Who's we? Who's we? Who do they think that is? It's not Rishi with his hard hat and his high-vis jacket.
Absolutely.
We've got to be very careful about some of this language. And I think very careful about some of the aspirations of government. Developers have to be given the right incentives. I think we've moved a little bit the right way, taking away some of these 106 restrictions and impositions, I think I'd call them.
Yeah.
Freed up a little bit. And if we take this area here in Docklands, now when I first came here probably 25 years ago, the Docklands Development Corporation said, right, developers, come in, you can build what you like. As long as you stick to building regs, you just apply for outline permission and you go build it. There was no heavy stuff over the planning.
Yeah.
And it just look what's happening down here. We've got some of the highest grossing shops in the country. We've got, over 25,000 new apartments being built over the next couple of years. It's just total success.
Yeah.
and it's because people had freedom to do it.
That's right. That's right. The government need to support developers and development and not make it more difficult than it already is. In this inflationary environment, build costs are so uncertain for developers. The least that the government can do is make sure the planning process is simple and efficient, so that developers aren't putting planning permission in and trying to forecast development costs that are going to be appropriate in 2 years' time when they finally get on site. So I think it's about freeing up the industry to develop, what is clearly developable land, rather than seeking more green spaces.
I think the message is government butt it out and leave it to the professionals, really.
And just unlock some of those blockages. Yeah. Do the bits, the bits that they're responsible for seem to be getting in the way. Reverse it.
Okay, all right. Well, let's move on to another subject close to development, and it's this. Can the panel please explain any differences in application requirements when applying for relatively short-term bridging loan as opposed to a conventional long-term facility? And I'm applying that to sort of development work or refurbishment work. Put your finance hat on. Is there a great deal of difference in the requirements?
I think the best way to think about this is from a short-term funding perspective. The lender is bothered about how are you going to pay this money back in that short time frame.
Okay.
Whereas a long-term loan, a mortgage, commercial loan, that's repayable over many years, the lender is interested in how can you afford that monthly payment for the next 5, 10 or 30 years. Yeah. So they are underwritten quite differently. The short-term lender is not as bothered about your credit profile or your affordability, your personal monthly cash flow. They're bothered about, have you got enough experience to complete this project in that 12 months? Will there be a good profit in it for you as the developer at the end? Because if so, then the lender is going to easily recover their funds. And is there a good market? If you're selling that property, is there a good market to sell it?
A solid exit strategy. Really.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas for the long-term debt, they're far more interested in your credit history. Have you been making payments on time for the last 6 years plus? And can you afford, if there's a void period, if you're not receiving rent for a couple of months, can you afford to subsidise that?
So in a way, it's a little closer or more akin to a buy-to-let mortgage, where the lender is much more interested in your rental income, how realistic that is, how good a property you've got to let that's not going to cause problems and everything else. So it's more based on the business aspect of it rather than your personal history, perhaps.
That's right, yes, absolutely.
Okay, got it. Well, that brings us nicely on to our discussion point for the programme, which is the future of the buy-to-let market. Now, people get fed up with me saying this, but we go back to the 80s, assured tenancies were created to give landlords security about getting their property back once let, but also, in fairness to the tenant, to give them an assured period of occupation. Now, with what's happening with some of the latest government legislation, we're having no-fault evictions, the negation of Section 21 to get your property back. Sounds like dangerous ground to me.
Yes, me too. I think there's so many factors going against landlords at the moment. Inflation, cost of maintenance, labour, materials, interest rates, the costs of mortgages, and then the legislation as well, I think is going to push a lot of landlords out of the market. People who have been in since just after the last crash or have managed to weather that storm and been in for 20 or 30 years, are we getting to a point now where it makes more sense for them to exit the market because they might have a lot of expense on refurbishment, so much red tape, so much legislation, and then not knowing if they can get their property back when they really need to might be a step too far. So I think over the short term, for those landlords and investors who are staying in the market, I think there could be some good opportunity over the next couple of years. I think it will, if it carries on in this direction, I think it will get to a point where the market resists and pushes back. Ultimately, if more and more restrictions are put in place on landlords, they're taking more risk every time they rent a property out. they're going to rent it out for more money. They're going to push rents up. And at some point, there'll be a point where things have to shift back a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think the short term, it'll be quite an active market. I think landlords who have made their money over the past 20, 30 years will think now's a good time to exit.
They've probably got good capital gain at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've had that cash flow for a sustained period. And I think there's bound to be some consolidation and some resetting in the next, I don't know, 2 to 5 years. Things might start to shift back a little bit, because there will be a breaking point, and then the government will realise that they need the private landlords to be active.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the worries I have, I've been involved in the sort of law courts for about 16, 17 years as a magistrate, and you hear a lot of problems. And I think one of the problems I've got is that with all this new government legislation about discrimination, about the need to allow your tenants to have pets, no fault evictions, all the rest of it. My worry is, where are those arguments going to take place, and how long are they going to take to get resolved? That's the real issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's no simple solution. I mean, even if you go to court now for rental debt, you can be looking anything up to 12 months to wait before you're in there.
Absolutely. Yes.
And of course, the moment you issue proceedings, people tend to say, right, well, I'm not paying my rent till it's settled then.
Absolutely. I've seen it. And it gets the most vulnerable as well. I've seen it with a retired couple. They've got one property and waiting for that court date for rent arrears. By the time the court date came, £26,000 of rent owing on a small buy-to-let in the north of England, and that was their pension gone. They had to sell the property. So if that's going to get worse, it's really going to penalise the wrong people, I think.
Yeah. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm joined by Simon Das. Welcome back, Simon. Simon, we're going to talk in a little more detail about the buy-to-let market at the moment. Now, one of the first questions that to come to mind that we've had once or twice, some people will say, is it better to buy perhaps in the north of England, perhaps in a seaside town where there's the attraction of the resort itself? Prices are somewhat cheaper than the south, so it might be a good thing to spread north. But on the other hand, the resort is going to be a little bit more expensive than the inland properties. Does that equate to return on capital? How does it work? Am I going to get more for a seaside investment than I am in something inland?
So there's so many different ways that you need to look at your figures, and you need to invest on what's important to you and on your own risk profile as well. Broadly speaking, you're going to see higher yields in the north of England, and depending on the resort and the area, those yields can vary quite drastically just over the course of a few miles. I know when I moved to Morecambe in 2011, I was looking at properties in Lancaster and in Morecambe that were 3 or 4 miles away, and I could have achieved about £500 a month rent on a 2-bed in Lancaster that would have cost me about 120,000. I could have achieved 475 for a larger property, a 4-5 bed in Morecambe, that would have cost me about £80,000. And that's just 3 or 4 miles away. I mean, ignore those figures in themselves. They're probably quite astonishing. A 4-bed house for £80,000. You can't buy them that cheap anymore. But one of the other benefits of the seaside town is the possibility of doing holiday accommodation as well. Obviously, there's a massive growth in that sector at the moment, but there's bound to be tightening of regulations in the future. So I think you need to make sure you're setting up properly. But we're looking at, we've got a block that's got a commercial unit and a couple of apartments above. One of the apartments is let for £550 a month, and we've just put the other apartment onto one of the holiday let websites, and we're getting £100 to £120 a night for that. We've had 3 bookings in our first week. So there's other options for you to try and increase your revenue.
Now here in London, we're restricted about holiday lets.
Yes.
Anything under 3 months needs planning consent,
Yeah.
and a lot of the blocks will prohibit such lets because they say it's detrimental to the wear and tear of the building, and
Yeah.
these companies will come in, do it for a while, then when it's time for refurbishment, just move on elsewhere and find another new block.
Yeah.
You don't have those sort of restrictions in the north.
Not in many places, and not as yet. I think, in Morecambe we've got Eden North coming that's going to attract up to 1 million visitors a year. And I imagine there'll be restrictions coming in because ultimately the town needs the B&Bs, the existing guest houses and hotels to do well as well. So I imagine those restrictions are going to be coming in, and I think it's important that if you are looking at that, you do everything correctly, from things like fire and security, and just making sure you're communicating with the local authority as well, and say, look at what we're doing, promote what you're doing, and show them that you're doing it correctly and effectively, and hopefully you'll be guided by them.
If as a buy-to-let landlord you're doing these overnight stay lets, are you subject to these holiday taxes that the hotels are?
Right, so going on to business rates essentially rather than council tax. Now there's a grey area there, but the way we're doing it is we are looking at using freehold blocks and running them as apart hotels mainly. So we are approaching the council for planning permission. So really you should be looking at changing the planning category of the property if you want to do it long term. I think if you want to try it out and see if the area is okay, you're likely to get away with it for a while. But just be aware that if you want to do something sustainably and for the long term, then
do it properly.
Yeah, get on the right side of regulation.
I think you're absolutely right. Now, the other thing, Simon, is that with all these changes coming in with buy-to-let, for instance, let me take the example of being obliged to allow tenants to have pets in the building, right? Now, I live in a block over the road here, and the lease is very clear. It says no pets of any kind at any time in the building. So which takes precedence? Is it the government's instruction to allow pets, or does my head lease take precedence?
Good question. And I think what will happen is ultimately the managing agent or the landlord will decide their own preference quite quietly.
It's not a preference. It's you're obliged to legally follow the terms of your lease.
Yes, and if I've got 3 people wanting to rent a 3rd floor apartment and one of those people has a big noisy dog, then I'm probably going to pick one of the others without telling them. Maybe I'm getting myself in trouble there, but I think the natural preference is going to decide. We have a policy internally that we allow pets, but we tend to only like them on the ground floor apartment or in a buy-to-let property. So I think you've got to be conscious of the neighbours. If people are out and they've got a dog barking in the flat above them, if there's a working tenant who has a dog stuck at home. So you've got to think about all these matters, and it's not black and white.
We get a lot of trouble here. People have pets, and perhaps dogs in particular, and a lot of these apartments around here, they're effectively glass boxes, and they get very hot if you don't have the comfort cooling on or whatever, and people go out all day, you don't want to leave that on, they leave their pet in there. And next stage is, RSPCA are called because the dog or the animal's in distress. I just worry about who's going to adjudicate on these matters in time to be effective.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's just going to cause another backlog in.
And I know you say the managing agents might want to try and instigate sort of discretion, if you like, but it's the same thing. I see the concierge. You get somebody come and say, "Look, can I take my dog inside? It's only this big," then of course the next person comes along and says, well, my dog's only that big.
Mm.
And by the time you're finished,
Yeah.
you're really in trouble. I think it's very difficult when government really start to interfere in lease construction. I think it's a very difficult thing.
I think it is, and on the whole, people who rent property, the majority understand that pets are not favoured, particularly pets that like dogs and cats that can cause damage to furniture, and they're pretty accepting of it. And yes, some will take matters into their own hands, and some will risk it, and some will have pets that are absolutely perfect and don't cause any trouble. Others have pets that do, and I think the market's going to be self-regulating, really, on that front.
I think the difficulty is the sort of thing the government came out with some months ago. I won't say a particular minister, but he said, "Oh, it's no problem. You can just increase the deposit to cover the cost of any damage the animal might do." Well, no, you can't, because the law says you can only go for 5 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever it is on a maximum deposit. So again, what takes precedence? I don't know.
I don't know. No, it's
very difficult. I think in essence we're in times when, we talked earlier about conveyancing being rather old-fashioned and bits stuck in the mud, really, and I think some of our leases are now. I think we need leases for the 21st century, don't we?
Absolutely, yeah. We need a bit of a shake-up.
We do indeed. And I suppose what's done a lot of good for this, on the good side of things, is co-living. That has developed a new kind of lease or license for people to live together as a community and share various facilities. And I'm very much in favour of that.
Absolutely, yeah. It can work really well. But then you see lots of disparity between the regulation on co-living properties compared to single lets, and then people who are homeowners don't need any regulation on their property. So there's still all these sort of mixed opinions, mixed messages, and I think really need sort of a level playing field and regulation across the board that is easy to understand and easy to implement.
Yeah, I think my pet gripe is the difference. I mean, you only need to look out the window here. You'll see a housing association block, and you'll see washing out on the balconies. You'll see satellite dishes all over the building. You'll turn your eyes to the right and look at a private building, and there'll be no infringements at all in that in that way. And I think that's very unfair and not very sensible. And again, people say, "Oh, well, it's only washing out on the balcony. What does it matter?" Well, you get these things called fire hop, don't you? Where it really is a fire hazard. You put a satellite dish on there. You've got an electronic instrument that can't be controlled from the ground. Yeah. And if there's a problem, a fire or anything else, it can be quite serious. But anyway, I don't suppose we're going to put the world totally right, are we, Simon? But I am going to thank you for coming in today and giving us the benefit of your views and your expertise. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.